Alrighty, sorry for the mildly late start this evening, but welcome to week 2, session 3 of my materials and rendering workshop. This session we're going to be talking about specular. I apologize in advance. I am currently battling a cold, nice summertime cold. So if my voice gets a little raspy towards the end, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm drinking some tea with honey, but we'll power on through. Um, for this session, we're going to be talking about specular and gloss maps, how they relate to metalness and roughness maps, and a few other things related to the general topic of specular. So let me just open up something that we had open recently, and I can start to get started about what goes into specular and gloss, metalness and roughness, just to give a general overview, and then from there, what we'll do is we'll start talking about the differences between metalness and roughness, or the differences between specular and metalness, and the differences between roughness and gloss. So let me just go in here and open this up. 1 second. Getting stuff together. It's been a crazy week for me already, so you know, lots of stuff going on. So let's open this old example scene that we had before and get started with some stuff. So, So here we've got a nice head that we were working on last week. Just throwing some different materials on it, playing around with different rendering modes and such. I'm going to be doing most of my stuff in Marmoset for this session, simply because basically everything that I'm going to be talking about transfers directly over into both Unreal 4 and Unity. And then probably next session I'll be jumping into Unreal 4 just a little bit, but for now it'll just be in Marmoset. So let's just make a new material, and let's just start playing around with it. And let's make this scene a little easier to look at, so it's just a nice plain background. Alrighty, and we'll make this a little less blindingly bright. There we go, that's marginally better. Okay, so we talked about albedo last week. We talked about diffuse shading. Let's talk about what specular is in reference to other types of shading that we've discussed. So, going from albedo, let's talk from there about the differences between the two different types of shading. So, albedo, or diffuse color, is the light that comes and hits a surface and bounces very slightly through the surface and picks up some color information as it exits on its way out. So it goes very slightly into the surface and then bounces directly back out in a diffuse way that, if you turn off the gloss, just kind of looks like that. It's let's turn down the Fresnel as well. So it just looks a bit like this when it's just the diffuse shading hitting stuff. So it's when you change the albedo color or the diffuse color, they're kind of interchangeable. Basically what you're changing is the color of light that is exiting the surface after it enters and exits. This has a few different topics that you can cover in just that little subsection of talking about shading, but what we're really concerned with is the difference between diffuse shading and specular. So let's talk about what specular actually is. So if we turn the diffuse color on this model to 100% black, what's going to happen is, or what that really simulates is the idea that light is coming from this light over here. It's shooting towards the model, and it's It's just never exiting. It's like a black hole. It never exits the surface of the model. It goes in and never reflects out as that diffuse shading. So cool, that's great. It's fairly easy to understand. It's like placing a filter over a light, or say maybe having light pass through, your tea or your coffee or something like that. That is very similar to what you would get from diffuse shading. Now, specular light is different in that specular light never penetrates the surface of the model. So let's look at some specular with no albedo contribution whatsoever. So we're going to turn up the specular intensity on this guy so that we can see some nice reflections. And let's turn off the some of the post effects just so that we're not distracted by anything else. So here we see something that only has specular light being reflected off it. The specular light in this case it's reflecting both the environment and the light coming from here. So that's this kind of shows you the light direction. We can change the fact that it's reflecting the environment by unhooking this light from the sky and then just turning the brightness of the sky down. So this is what specular light looks like when it's coming just from a little point light. This light has no width to it whatsoever, and actually if we focus in on it, you can see that it's basically just a point. I'm rotating around it right now, and the only thing you can see is its little representational icon in here. This would look pretty much the same in Unreal, Unity, or basically any other program. It'd just have a little light icon. If I turn off the light icon, you can see that nothing's there. However, Marmoset lets you do some interesting stuff, and other engines are allowing you to do this as well, though it still introduces some performance costs. In Marmoset, one of the things that you can do is introduce a width to your light. So here you can see the gizmo for the light, and I can rotate the light in various degrees and move it around, but we can change the width of the light. So if I crank up this slider right here, you can see that the light gets wider or smaller, and we can also change the length and the height so that it actually turns into this kind of squarish shape. So what does this actually mean for specular shading? Well, among other things, it means that if the light is wider, and let me turn on the visible shape for this so that we can always see it. If the light is wider, what's happening is light is being shot out from all surfaces of this light as opposed to just a point, meaning that instead of the highlight on here being fairly sharp with a high gloss value, it's going to start to get a little more diffuse. So you can see that the shape of the highlight is getting much wider and a bit dimmer. So we're going to talk about why it gets dimmer in just a minute. That has to do with energy conservation. But for now, what we want to talk about is how this light is being reflected off the surface. Now this light, let's just change this back to a single little point. This light is being reflected off the surface, and that's all that's happening. It's not going into the surface, it's not picking up properties of the surface, it is only hitting the surface and then bouncing off. And the light that's bouncing off is the light that's happening to bounce off towards where the camera is, where the view angle is. Now what this means is that since the light doesn't penetrate into the surface of this model or anything else that you would be getting specular light on, the light is always going to stay the same color as long as the specular color of the surface stays the same, or as long as the color of the light stays the same. Lights can have various different colors. You can change a light to any color you wish, and it will reflect back at you as that color. You can see at the very core of this reflection that it looks pretty much the same color as this little picker box right here. By the same token, if you change the specular color, it changes to that color. Now, what does this mean to change the specular color? Well, one, it's not changing the color in the same way that diffuse shading changes the color. So as I mentioned before, diffuse shading is light penetrating the surface and then being ejected out, sort of like subsurface scattering on a very, very tiny scale. With specular light, what's happening is the light is being reflected directly off the surface without penetrating into the model, and that's the light you're seeing. And any time that there is a color to the specular, that means that anything aside from that color you see is actually being completely absorbed into the surface. So in this case, all light except red light, because this is just 255 red, all light except red light is being absorbed into the surface of this model completely and is not reflecting outwards. It's just being, in the case of a physical object, what would be happening is it would be going into the surface and then it would turn into heat. It would turn into heat energy. So when you hit a surface and you see red reflected back, what that means is that the blue light and the green light and any other colors of light are being absorbed. Now, by that same token, if it looks blue or if it looks green or something, all the other colors are being absorbed into the surface. They're not exiting, and all that's reflected back is that wavelength. So this is important because there are two different types of surfaces in general. There is a bit of wiggle room in between them, but in general, there are two different types of surfaces that you need to worry about when you talk about specular light. The first type of surface is called a dielectric, or a non-metal material. They are surfaces, materials that do not conduct electricity, and at the same time, they're also materials that have a diffuse component. They also have a specular component, but in general, the specular component is much lower than metallic surfaces, metals. So, what the hell does this mean for us exactly? Especially when we're talking about specular versus metalness versus, gloss and roughness. Like, what is all this crap? So, let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about something similar to, say, plastic. Let's do a nice kind of greenish plastic for this guy's head. Actually, just a bright green plastic. We'll set the specular value to something appropriate for plastic, and we'll get into that in just a second. We'll set it to fairly glossy, but not too much. And here we have something that looks fairly similar to what you might expect from a green plastic toy. Nice opaque green plastic, like the Incredible Hulk or something like that. So most surfaces, such as wood, plastic, paint, glass, water, all these sort of everyday types of materials tend to reflect more or less the same amount of light as specular light. That is, they tend to reflect about 4% of whatever light hits them as specular light. The rest of that light is usually reflected as diffuse light, or it's refracted outwards if it's something like a gemstone. Now, this is handy to know because this ties in directly with how metalness works and how using, say, a specular map instead of a metalness map works. So, let's talk about just specular maps for a second. Then we'll jump into metalness maps. Then we'll sort of compare and contrast the two. So let's duplicate this head. And we're going to move it right over here. Okay, so these are two identical heads. We're going to focus on them. On this guy, on our left, we're going to keep this same material. But on the guy on the right, we're going to make a slightly different material that is going to give exactly the same look. But the difference between the two will be that one uses specular and one uses metalness. So let's just duplicate that material. We'll call the first one specular, the other one metalness. We'll drag the metalness onto this guy just to apply it. Now we're going to change the reflectivity mode from specular to metalness. And what this is going to do for us is it's going to give us a result that is something that you would see in Unreal 4, something you might see in many other engines. But you'll notice that when I have the metalness cranked down to 0 on this guy on the left, or on his left, on our right, it looks identical to the one here on the left. And this is because when you're using a metalness map, if you set it to 0, using most fairly standardized math, what you'll get is a specular value of 4%, or identical to what's in here. It's 4% of 1, so 0.4, or 0.04. Now, if you crank up the metalness, what that's going to do is exactly the same thing as converting the specular color to green. So let's do that now. So as you slide this metalness slider, or potentially add lighter and lighter values to your metalness map, what it's going to do is it's going to darken the diffuse color and replace the specular color with whatever is here in the diffuse slot, or the albedo slot. Now we can achieve this exact same thing by going into the specular over here. We'll just do this. We'll save this color. We'll change the specular map intensity to 1. And I'll talk about why he turned just black in a second. And then we'll set the color to that same green. And just make sure that this is down to completely black. So, as you can see, once again, these two are completely identical. So, the difference between a specular and a metalness map is that when you're using a specular map, something interesting happens when you, or rather, when you're using a metalness map, something interesting happens when you raise the metalness value. Let's make a quick metalness map just to demonstrate this as efficiently as possible. What we're going to do is we're going to make half of this guy's head metal and the other half just a plain old plastic. So we're just going to make a new document. Let's call it 512. So we're going to take this half right here. We're going to make it fully black, and this is going to be our metalness map. Okay, so now if we come back to here, put this back down to 0, and find that metalness map, well, here you can see that, let's just do this real quick. Here you can see that this side of his head still looks like that plastic material. This side of his head looks like metal, and any values in between you can only see because the map is very low res. Okay, so this is kind of cool. This is interesting. It's still kind of confusing though, right? Because why would you use one or the other? What is the difference in production when you're using a metalness map versus a specular map? How do metalness and specular maps look different? Well, let's take a look at the differences between the two. For example, I have a metalness map right here, but in theory this could be used as a specular map. It could be 100% reflective over here and not reflective over here, and shouldn't that give us an effect similar to what we see over here? I mean, I did say earlier that when we have a very high specular value, it's going to make it so that it looks like metal. So let's try applying that same map to this guy as the specular map, and take a look at what happens and discuss the results. So let's do the same thing, but plug that into the specular slot. Okay. So this is interesting. What happened? Well, it's pretty simple. On the metalness map, as I said before, it's taking the color from the albedo and replacing the specular color with that color. When I have a specular map and I have white and black, all it's actually doing is having white for the specular color over here and black for the specular color over here. If we change this, if we change a little square of this, like right here, to a gray tone, and save that, we're going to see, once that reloads, that, here we go. So you can see that that gray tone is now a higher specular value. And at the same time, since it's the same map, this over here is starting to get a greenish highlight. That's because it's halfway towards turning this into metal, so it's starting to pick up some of the green highlights from over here, but it's not 100% there yet. Okay, let's reset. Let's get rid of these maps. Let's turn the light back over here. Let's crank our specular down and our metalness down. And let's talk a little bit about different types of materials and how you can represent them using just a specular map. So I mentioned before that most everyday materials have a specular reflection value of 4%. Okay, so what that means is that if you have two materials, such as wood and plastic right next to each other, how are you going to, well, the big main question is, how are you going to sort of display the difference between those two materials? I mean, if they're reflecting the same amount of detail, or the same amount of specular light, how can you get a sort of difference between those two materials? Now, the answer to that question is sort of multifaceted, because it goes back to when we were talking about things like subsurface scattering and all kinds of other stuff. However, one of the biggest contributors to making sure that you have good material definition, between one material and the material right next to it, is gloss. So let's talk about gloss and specular maps. Let's talk about color for specular maps, and then we'll talk about gloss or roughness for metalness maps, and then we can sort of unify our understanding of both so that we can jump into engines that use specular maps or engines that use metalness. So for a model that uses multiple materials, you're going to want to have a specular map that, unless there's metal on that material or some sort of odd material like car paint that has colored reflections, you're basically just going to want a flat gray color for your specular map. Now, if you go and you do a bunch of really annoying math with a lot of really annoying numbers that have really long strings that go to infinity of just a bunch of crazy shit beyond the decimal point, what you'll end up with when you convert 4% in linear space to 4% gray in something you could paint in Photoshop is a value of 56, 56, 56 for your RGB channels. So let's fill this with 56, 56, 56 gray. Save that and apply it to this model. So let's take a look at the highlight right here on his cheek. This is a nice tight highlight to take a look at. Now, our specular intensity is 4%, and if we plug that map in, it's going to change that value automatically in the slider to 1. But you'll notice if I turn this map, if I turn this map off or on, well, okay, let's do this a little easier since Marmoset's pitching a fit here. Let's get rid of that. Turn this back down to 0.04. So here we have one that has the specular map, and here we have one that just has the value in the slider. You're going to notice that nothing changes when I apply this other material. There, we can do it a few times just to show the difference. And you can see as I switch back and forth between these two that what this slider does is it takes the intensity of whatever is in this map and just tweaks it and just adjusts it from 100% whatever is in that map to 0% of whatever's in that map. All right, cool. So that's how you would get just a general flat specular value for basically any material, whether it's wood or ceramic or your keyboard or the windows on your house. Generally, barring a few very minor exceptions, they will all have a specular value of 0.04 or 56, 56, 56. Now, to get more interesting materials, to get definition in materials, you want to play with your gloss. This is going to be the main contributor to whatever material definition you're going for. So as you play with your gloss map, as you play with the gloss slider, you'll notice that this highlight from the light, it gets wider and wider and softer and starts to look a little more like diffuse light. And after a certain point, it's almost completely gone. By that same token, if you go higher and higher and higher, your object starts to get shinier and shinier until you just have these really, really, really tight little highlights. So if you want to represent, say, a rough wood texture right next to a shiny paint, like you might see on a wall or any sort of object, or maybe you have some paint splatter in your survival horror game, this is a great way to show the difference between two materials. So let's look at how we can author a gloss map. It's very simple. It's the same as authoring any other type of map. We'll just come in here to Photoshop. Let's just duplicate this. Call this gloss. Alright, so we have this nice flat gray color. Let's take a look at how this gray color affects what we see on our model. So we'll just save this one. It's the same value as before. We'll just save it as gloss. Come back in here and load it into the gloss channel. Alright, so clearly when we load that gloss map, that gray value is pretty low. Now, what we actually just did, taking that same gray value that we used for specular, is we put a 4% gloss value into our slider. So let's do this. Let's put the gloss at 0.04 and drag that onto here. Alright, now let's turn this gloss map on and drag that material on. Oh, well, there we go. It looks exactly the same. Gloss map, slider. Gloss map, slider. Okay, well, that's peachy. That's not really super helpful, but what else can we do? Well, if you want to get, for example, a 50% value, 0.5 value. You could have that 0.5 value in here. You just plug in a 0.5. So that's 50%, and you can see that it's much glossier than it was, but it's still pretty rough. Let's just switch back and forth, and you can start to see the difference. That's the 4%, and that's the 50%. If you want to get a nice, say, 50% gloss value, you'd come back into Photoshop, and I believe it should be actually, let me just double check my notes. 1 second. I have to double check this because I don't want to give you guys the wrong value, because that would be terrible. I'm supposed to be educating you. So 1 second while I check in with my notes. So to get a 50% gray, it's going to be yes, it's going to be 188, 188, 188, 188, 188, 188. So let's fill that. Okay, cool. So let's save this. Go back over here. Now it's reloaded our map right here, so let's drag that on there. Make sure that this is in sRGB. Okay, so if we drag that on there and then go back and drag it on again and then go back, you can see once again no difference. So to get the linear value, this 0 to 1 value, there's a lot of math involved, but there are some handy-dandy people out there who've made some really cool tools. And I'll be giving, it's essentially an Excel spreadsheet. I'll be giving it to the folks in the who paid for the program, and then once the program's over, I'll be releasing that as well. But it's basically just a little calculator sheet that lets you plug in a value and get the Photoshop value for it. But yeah, there you go. To get a 0.5 value in linear space, as opposed to the 128 you might be used to, which is this, you would convert it from sRGB, which is the color you use in Photoshop, to linear color. Okay, cool. That's great. Peachy keen. Now let's talk about something a little different. Let's talk about colored specular and how it affects what we see in here. So colored specular is kind of a weird topic because it ties in directly to the conversation with specular versus metalness. Now, as we mentioned before, if you have a metalness map or you have a metalness value higher than 0, you're going to start getting colored reflections and a darker albedo color. This is not the same thing that will happen when you're using a colored specular map. I'll show you why. So let's come back in here and let's make a new file, and this one will be our spec map. We'll fill this with that 4% gray, so 56, 56, 56. We'll save that. Specular color. All right. Oop, it would help if I actually filled it with that color. Save that. Now let's plug it into here. We'll just call this colored spec. Okay, and we'll apply it to this guy right here. We'll get our spec map. So you'll notice that nothing changed because the spec map and the other map that we had in there have the same value. So it's still reflecting just this kind of grayish tone. Now, if we go back into here and we start painting in bright colors, we're going to see some massive differences. Most notably, there's going to be some weird color behavior in here, and the specular reflections and the specular amount they're going to change drastically. So let's just put some nice blobs of color, just for effect, and we can see how these blobs of color affect the specular reflections. So we'll save that, come back over here. Okay, so let's turn this guy off so we can see a little better. And let's turn the sky back on. Oopsie. Unlink that. Turn the sky back on just so we have some nice fill light. It's a little too bright. Okay, cool. So, what have we got here? We have a nice base color of green, and then we have a yellow, a pink, and a cyan color for the specular values. Okay, so we are definitely getting some yellow specular over here, where you'd expect to see it on there, some pink specular here, and some cyan bluish specular over here. Now, as I mentioned before, you might start having some weird color behavior when you start using colored specular. Now, what I mean by this is that if you use colored specular and you have color in your diffuse channel underneath those specular reflections, you'll start to get odd behavior in that because the surface of your model is reflecting specular light of certain colors. In this example, you have some pink right here. The underlying colors are going to start looking less pink. And this is where we're going to start talking about energy conservation a little bit. Now, energy conservation means that any light hitting the surface, well, no, you can't have more light reflecting back because that would mean that your surface is sort of luminous. So energy conservation says that if you have light hitting the surface and bouncing back immediately without penetrating into the surface, you're not going to get that same color reflecting in a diffuse way off of the material. So there shouldn't be any, or there should be very little diffuse contribution in the sort of the pink range of the spectrum in this whole area, because it's being reflected immediately before it penetrates the surface and ejects out. So let's change the color of the model, of the diffuse color, to something that will show this a little better. Let's change it to a sort of pink color. Okay. Okay, this is better. Now, you'll notice in these dark areas, this is the part that I'm talking about. The light is hitting the surface, immediately bouncing off, and the surface is not getting any diffuse light in the pink end of the spectrum because it's all being reflected as specular light. So when I was talking earlier about light penetrating through the surface and diffusing out, this is why that was important. So if we wanted to do the same thing with blue light, we could just, or kind of a cyan color, we could just change this. I'll change this to 255 and 255, and you'll notice in this area, anything underneath, any diffuse contribution you would expect is not going to be as strong because it's reflecting off as specular light. Okay, cool. So that's sort of how specular, how colored specular works with colored undersurfaces, with colored diffuse underneath. But you see lots of metals that have colored specular light. You see or colored specular reflections. So how can we sort of get a metallic look? This sort of looks metallic right now in that it has this interesting set of reflections on it. However, it doesn't, for example, this area especially, just simply doesn't look metallic. It looks more like it's just got a weird greenish sheen to it. this is where we start to intersect with metalness. So, like I've said a few times, metals have very little or no diffuse contribution. It's all specular light coming off them. So if you want to represent a metallic surface, something that, for example, is a bright yellow or a pink or a cyan, the diffuse contribution in that area has to be very low or zero. So in those areas, you would have a black diffuse color, and everything else around them would be colored. So let's duplicate this image and do that real quick. We'll just duplicate this. Call this diffuse. Okay, so we're going to just make a nice diffuse map real quick. We're going to desaturate this. We're going to crank this up so that it's bright white. Alrighty. Make that black. We're just going to use this as a mask. We're going to make a nice solid color fill layer. It's just going to be a kind of, well, we'll pick a greenish color over here. Okay. Then we're going to copy that and paste it into there. All right. We'll invert that. Okay, so this is going to be, oops, hang on, that's not 100% black. We'll do a levels on there. There we go. Okay. So we're going to assume that all these black areas right here, all three of these black areas, are going to be metallic, and they're going to have the specular colors of these stripes right here. So let's save this as diffuse. Come back in here and start plugging stuff in. So for our albedo slot, we want this to be white because that color in there is just going to multiply on top. So we'll just change that to white. Load our diffuse. Oops, that's our gloss map. Don't want to load that one. We'll load our diffuse, and there we go. Okay, that's interesting. That's cool. Alrighty. So, as you can see, in this pink area, which corresponds to this middle stripe, it's starting to look a little more like a colored metal. And this area, it looks kind of like a gold or a brass. Over here, it looks kind of like a bluish metal. You know, these might be something you'd see on, say, an anodized metal or a Christmas tree ornament or something like that. If we adjust the gloss so that it reflects a little better, you can see that the specular amount on here is very high compared to the specular amount here, and these start to look even more like metals. Well, okay, that's good, but as I mentioned before, one of the best ways to get material definition between two different areas, since these are starting to look kind of samey, is to play with gloss. So let's go back to let's go back in here, and we'll just copy this over to our gloss texture. We'll change this to something a lot lower. So all these areas that look dark, these are going to be less glossy. All this green stuff is going to be less glossy, so it's going to accentuate everything in the metallic area. So we'll save that. We'll turn the gloss map back on. Turn it back all the way up. Oh, it's still not looking too good, so let's make this a lot brighter. Oh, that's looking pretty good. Still not great, but it's looking better. Let's just do a level adjustment on the whole thing. There we go. That's better. Now we're starting to see a lot better material definition. We're seeing it with our specular level and with our gloss. Okay, so we've talked about metalness and specular, but how can you replicate this same thing using a metalness map as opposed to a bunch of stuff, a gloss map and a specular map and a diffuse map and stuff? Well, it's pretty simple. Instead of having black areas in your diffuse map when you're using metalness, you're instead going to want to have all the same colors, all these colors, in your diffuse all at once, and then you're going to use the metalness map to pick out the areas that you want to be metallic. So let's copy this over to our diffuse texture, put it in there, and then we'll also copy this mask. Let's copy that, paste it in here. So in this instance, all the white stuff is going to be metallic, and all the black stuff is going to be non-metallic. We'll just invert that so that the stripes are going to look the same. And we'll save the metalness map, and we'll save the diffuse map. We'll put the metalness shader on here. And let's see, let's load up our gloss. Turn that back to there. Our albedo, or our diffuse, and our metalness. Well, now it's looking the same. It looks almost identical. Now, because of the way metalness maps work, you might occasionally see in areas where there is a transition from metallic, the white, to non-metallic, the black, you might see a little bit of artifacting on your final model if you have mixed materials on the same surface like this, but usually it's not too much of a problem. So you can see it just a little bit in this sort of halo right here. So that's how you can use specular and metalness to get colored reflections. Now, metalness has some limitations. Specifically, it can only do metallic surfaces, such as, well, metals, or, you know, something you might see on a Christmas tree ornament, maybe an anodized metal, and it can only do, and conversely, it can also only do things that have a constant specular value or specular color, such as wood or plastic or glass. The problem with this is that we've got a question here. Quick question. You don't have those streaks in the normal map, but the edge of the metalness is catching light. Yes, actually, what's happening right now, when you see it's a little more obvious over here. When you see this change, when you see this halo around it, that's actually not an artifact of the metalness map. It's an artifact of using the gloss map. So if I turn off the gloss map and just use a constant gloss value for the entire surface, there's not going to be that transitional area from low gloss to high gloss, so you're not going to get the slight halo around things. Here you can see that slight halo. These pixels right here correspond to these ones right here, and you'll notice that in between the bright white and the, oh, I'm sorry, this is the gloss. In between the 4% gray and the bright white, you have these transitional pixels with anti-aliasing. These ones are catching the light such that they have kind of blurry reflections. So that's why you're getting, that's why I'm getting that little artifact there along the edge. You can see it a little bit over here as well, though it's not quite as obvious just because of the colors that I'm using. And let's see here. Oh, there's also another question about getting rid of artifacts with metalness. Uh, there there are options for removing artifacts from metalness. Unfortunately, they're kind of hacky and they don't always work very well. The best way that I've found to get rid of these little halos, like this dark line, when using metalness, is to go into your metalness map and do something like a levels adjustment to make it so that either it gets brighter, you push the highlight out, or you push the shadow in. Aside from that, there isn't much that you can do because unless you're using textures that have absolutely no anti-aliasing, you're simply not going to be able to get good artifactless surfaces. So let me show how that looks when I push the highlight out so that it has no anti-aliasing. So what this is doing in this area is it's pushing the diffuse contribution to 0, and the specular contribution is going to be coming from whatever is in that area of the albedo map. Now it's kind of a dark green color in whichever one I had it in. Oh my goodness. Oh, there we go. It's kind of this green color, so it's not reflecting a ton of light, so that's why it's a darker green in that area. Now, if I come back in here and I push this in, it's probably going to look a little bit better, but still not much. Let's make sure I save that. Yeah, it's still not, it's not great. Mostly because it's just, it simply can't get all the detail around those edges. So both options have drawbacks, and really the easiest way to avoid artifacts like this is to use a specular map. The problem with using a specular map with colored specular and a diffuse map is that you then have two full color textures that have to be loaded into memory when you are making a character or making an object for your game that's going to have multiple colors and multiple surfaces on it. If you make something with a metalness map, the metalness map, since it's just black and white, could in theory be packed into, say, the alpha channel of the diffuse, or both the gloss map and the metalness map could all be put into the same file by packing them into different channels. So if I wanted to take this gloss map and put it into the red channel, I could do that. And if I put the metalness into the green channel, I could do that. And then I could have another texture in the blue channel. And what you end up with is a texture with multiple different things. Here, let me just put something in the blue channel just to illustrate. What you often end up getting is a texture that looks like this, where each channel is a different map. So that's the main advantage of using metalness, is that both gloss and metalness can be packed into the same texture. Now, if you have a texture, if you have a material that doesn't have a lot of mixed materials in it, if you don't have something that requires colored specular, you actually can use this same technique and just put the specular map into one of the channels, because really it's just going to be a grayscale map at that point. Dylan says, it seems like the best way to hide the artifacting is hiding edges via the model. And that's true, actually. One of the best ways, especially with how powerful computers and consoles are these days, one of the best ways to hide your sins is to just model everything out and model out the divisions in where the materials are, unless it's something like face paint or some other like really flush surface. And Omar asks, what's the solution to the memory issue with the spec workflow? Uh, well, there are two different ways of approaching it. One is to make it so that you just use metalness, essentially. However, if you want colored specular, uh, there's only really two ways that you can do it with current shading technology, and that is with a metalness map or an RGB map. The good thing about a lot of specular maps is that they don't always have to be very high res. So sometimes you can actually make a specular map that's a little smaller than your diffuse map, and people won't often notice unless you have lots of material divisions, kind of like you have here on the same surface. All right, so let's get on to a slightly different but related topic. Let's talk a little bit about different types of specular light, different types of reflections, and how they affect the shading of your model, not just in terms of what we've been talking about for the past hour or so, but also in terms of how they interact with the environment. So let's just make a new material, clean this up, and start from scratch. Okay. So there are different types of specular that you're going to see in games, especially in modern games that you might see, say, on the PS4, the Xbox One, even the Nintendo Switch, certainly in PC games, and in almost any game that uses Unreal 4, Unity 5, and above. You're going to see three different types of specular light. One, you're going to see specular light that comes directly from a directional light, whether it's a direction light, a spotlight. Let's just give this a little bit of width so that we can see it. Or an omni-light. Those are the three basic types of lights that you'll see in games and rendering in general. I'm going to be going over these different types of lights in the future, but let it suffice to say that these are the lights that are going to be doing things like casting shadows, having nice point highlights like you can see right here, and just generally lighting things in scenes and lighting characters. They're the main tools in your toolbox for lighting characters, and they are the things that you're going to see providing light in games. The second type of specular light you're going to see is image-based reflections. So image-based reflections are pretty much exactly what they sound like. They are a reflection that looks like a picture. So that picture can really be anything. It can be as simple as a white dot on a black background, or it can be as complex as any of, say, the presets that come with Marmoset Toolbag. I'm not going to get into like the specifics of how these work with work mathematically and such. It's kind of unimportant for what we're doing, but let it suffice to say that what these image-based lights do is they provide directional ambient light for your characters, and they also provide reflections of the environment for your characters. So beyond the lights in your scene that are casting, casting shadows and such, and there we go. Beyond the lights in your scene that have a direction like this, and they're casting shadows, and they're doing stuff that's really easy to understand by just looking at your model. Image-based lights are going to apply similar types of lighting, but to all areas in a 360-degree arc around your model. So let's turn off this little key light, and we can take a look at some different environments to show how they affect lighting on your model, and to sort of give a demonstration of how they can work with different levels of gloss and specular, and basically give a rundown of how they will affect things, and then we can start talking about the third type of specular. So image-based lights, as I mentioned before, they're a 360-degree image. You can see many of them here. And they can be captured in many different ways. The ones that you see here in Marmoset are captured by pointing a camera with a wide-angle lens in 6 different directions to capture the front, back, left, right, and top and bottom views of a scene in the real world, a place. Now, when those images are captured, they come with a lot of data about how bright the lights in the scene are, how much reflected light there is, and then they're all stitched together into one big panorama, which is then warped around the scene. So let's turn on the backdrop so we can see. So here you can see that the image has been wrapped around the environment, almost like it's being projected on the inside of a sphere. You can see the archway here, and let's make the camera a little wider so that we can see more. Here we go. There we go. So this looks like we're looking at the inside of a sphere that has an image projected on it. Now, for every single pixel in this image, what's happening is light is being projected onto the model from the direction of that pixel. And that's how you get all these nice colored highlights. And you can actually see on this guy's forehead right now, you can see the reflection of that archway and the building on the other side. This is image-based lighting in action. Now, image-based lighting is computationally expensive, but worth it. Because what it can do is it can help ground your models in a scene. For example, you can apply the same principle of taking a bunch of photos and slapping them together into a panorama by doing the same thing in a game engine. So this is how you get image-based lighting in a game. If you've ever heard of light probes or cube maps, that's exactly what they're talking about. They take images from up, down, the left and right, forward, and backward. They stitch them all together in engine, and then they take the light information in the exact same way to have per pixel lighting being cast onto your model. Now, image-based lighting has some limitations unless you are using an offline renderer like, say, Mental Ray. Namely, unless you have global illumination or radiosity in your engine, which most engines don't at this point, and we'll get into that later on in one of the later sessions, you're not going to get any shadows from the image-based lighting. You're only going to get reflections. Now, you can change the amount of reflection by adjusting the specular intensity and the gloss, and you can also change how bright the actual sky is, either with a slider or any number of other methods depending upon your engine of choice. But yeah, so even if you have, say, let's take, what's a good one that has some nice directional light in it? You know what? This is a good one. So in this image, in this image-based lighting scenario, we have a nice lamp right up here that should, in theory, cast shadows similar to the ones that we're seeing from the tree in the scene. So you have multiple trees in this scene that are casting shadows. However, because this is not actually a point light in the scene, it's just an image wrapped around everything, it's not going to cast any shadows. So this is where you would need to start putting point lights, which you can do in Marmoset simply by clicking here in the little preview, or if you're in a game engine, you would actually get your image-based lighting after you had placed lights in your scene, so that you could have those lights in the IBL. Okay, so that's the general topic of image-based lighting. There's a little more we could go into in the future, but for now, that's in general, image-based lighting and image-based reflections. That's sort of how they work and how they affect what you're looking at. Now, the final type of specular we're going to look at is actually Fresnel specular, or Fresnel reflections. Now, you guys might have heard of Fresnel in the sense of adding, say, sort of a halo around a character for, special lighting effects in older engines. If you ever worked with UDK or Unreal 3, you would probably have added some Fresnel to a shader or something at some point just to make it look like your character was kind of popping out from their environment. However, these days we don't do that as much because it's not really physically accurate, and it doesn't work in the same way as real Fresnel reflections do. So what the hell are Fresnel reflections? Well, before I get to that, let me just restrict the field of view a little bit more so this guy doesn't look like he's a weird bubble face. Okay, that's better. So Fresnel reflections are interesting because basically what they do is reflect light only at glancing angles. So, well, what exactly does that mean? Let's turn off, or completely down, the intensity of the specular map so we can see some Fresnel reflections. Okay, so even though I turned down the specular intensity on this guy, and you can see up here that he's not reflecting that light above, as we angle the camera like this, you can see that reflections actually do start to appear. Now, this is what we mean when we say Fresnel reflections. Fresnel reflections only appear at glancing angles on every single surface, and they happen because as light is coming in at those glancing angles, it just kind of skips off the surface and bounces off. Now, you can actually see this in real life when you go and, say, look at a shiny car. You'll notice that even if the car is completely black, like, say, this, at glancing angles, you'll still see really strong reflections of what's just beyond the surface of the car because of Fresnel reflections. So Fresnel reflections are actually based on somebody whose last name was Fresnel, and I'm probably slightly mispronouncing it because the guy was French. But yeah, he was a French mathematician, physicist, who discovered this, or described this effect. Now that we understand how it works, we can incorporate it into shading of models. And what happens with Fresnel reflections is not only does the light bounce off at glancing angles, but what you actually see with Fresnel reflections is, well, there's two components to it. There's a gloss component and there's a specular component. So we talked a little bit about gloss earlier, but what you'll notice with Fresnel reflections is as you get closer to being sort of 90, 180 degrees off from your viewing angle, things get a lot more glossy and they actually get more reflective. So the closer you approach to the edge of the model, the more reflective it's going to get as it's turning away from you, and the glossier it's going to get. It's an interesting little physical property, and you can actually see it on your skin. You can see it on basically any surface that you look at, and the only time you rarely see a lot of Fresnel is when something is a very rough surface. So if we turn down the gloss on here, you notice that yes, the Fresnel reflections start to spread out as you would expect from something that's not glossy. The reflection kind of diffuses outwards, but the brightness also goes down because it's reflecting less light towards your view. The light is going off in other directions, so you're getting less light coming at you. Okay, so we've covered specular, we've covered how specular and gloss relate, we've covered how spec maps and metalness maps kind of relate to each other. Let's talk about some different, let's talk about one other type of specular that isn't in one of those three categories. Something that's a little bit off the beaten path, but something that you can still use to great effect in a lot of different ways. So let's do one more new material. We're going to call this anisotropic. So I mentioned this before in the first session. Anisotropic reflections are specular reflections that are not the same in all directions. So anisotropic literally means not the same in some orientation. And I'm going to show you an example of how you can use anisotropic reflections for things like hair, brushed metal, and other surfaces that have a lot of small or even microscopic sort of lines or striations in them. And I'm going to sort of explain how they work and how you can apply them and sort of just the general theory behind them. And then I'm going to dive into how you can actually use multiple specular reflections on the same surface to get nice faked effects for things like hair. So we're going to do a quick example on just this gray surface, and then we'll switch back over to the one that has some textures to get a better look. So, anisotropic reflections. They're not the same in all directions, but what exactly does that mean for us? Well, as you can see here, this highlight on here, and let's make this color a little darker so it's easier to see the highlight. This highlight on here is generally pretty round. It's isotropic. It is the same in all directions. It is round. It is, from the center of the highlight, you can radiate it out in all directions, and if you take a measurement of the specular reflection in a given area, it will be more or less the same. Now, this surface does have some little undulations in it, so it's not going to be perfect. But if we had a perfect sphere, we would get a completely isotropic or circular specular highlight, as long as we have a light that's, actually round. But what if we wanted to change that? What if we wanted, for example, a highlight that is, not round? Now, hair, you've probably noticed, has highlights that look a little more like what we're seeing here. When hair and brushed metal reflect light, they do it by reflecting off lots of tiny strands that are stuck together. And what that means is that all those little round highlights next to each other make what looks like a band of specular. So there are lots of ways to achieve this in different engines. As I said, I'm not going to get into it in Unreal because the shader system that they use in the current version of Unreal is not super conducive to quick demonstrations of how this specular works. But trust that you can achieve the same thing in engines other than Marmoset. So let's change the way that this specular behavior works so that we can see some anisotropic specular and makes things start to look like hair. So in our reflection model over here, you have a few different options in Marmoset. You have mirror, which is exactly what it sounds like, Blin Phong and GGX, which are two different methods of calculating specular values. I'm going to get into those once again a little later in this course when I describe the differences between different types of shaders and shading. Let it suffice to say that with Blin Phong, it's a little bit tougher to get very rough looking surfaces. Blin Phong tends to be good for things that look like plastic or maybe shiny metals, people who look sweaty, that type of thing. And GGX, which is based on some research from the people at Disney, is a lot better at getting really rough looking surfaces. What we're looking for right now, though, is anisotropic. So if you select anisotropic, it's going to do some crazy stuff immediately. Okay, so what exactly is it doing? Now, you can see that when you select anisotropic, instead of being a nice round highlight, it just took the highlight and stretched it all to hell. It's going from the top of here to the bottom. It looks really weird. How does that work? What does it mean for us? Well, with anisotropic reflections, what it's going to do is it's going to actually take, it's going to, oh, you know what? Let's duplicate this. Call it isotropic. Let's delete some of this other stuff just so that we're nice and organized. So we have isotropic and anisotropic right near each other just so we can click on them easily. We'll change this back to GGX. Plop that on there. Okay, so we have the same highlight in the same general location right here, but with anisotropic shading, it actually stretches it down along the UV coordinates. So on my UV map for the hair, I have the part of the hair at the top of the UV space and the bottom of the hair at the bottom of the UV space. And with anisotropic reflections, it's literally taking the information from this highlight and just stretching it along the UVs. Now I can control how much it's stretched along the UVs by playing with the anisotropy slider here. And what that's going to do is it's going to push it from being either a round highlight to a band or vice versa. It literally just transforms in the UV space that specular highlight. Now that's great, but this doesn't exactly look like hair, because hair, when it receives reflections, gets the highlight right there, and then with each subsequent hair next to it, the highlight spreads out along a band going in that direction. So with anisotropic highlights, you need to be able to control the direction of the highlight. In this case, you control this by adjusting the anisotropy direction right here. It's a slider that goes 360 degrees. Really, we only need from 0 to 180 if we want to do something funky. In our case, we only really need 0 to 90. So what this is doing is it is rotating the direction of that reflection from going along the v-axis to going along the u-axis. So instead of being up and down, it goes left to right. Okay, cool. So this still doesn't look like hair, it just looks like a weird, I don't know, it looks like it's reflecting a lightsaber. So that's not super helpful yet. However, by changing a few things, we can make it start to look like hair. We can change the gloss, which is going to spread the highlight out, make it a little dimmer, make it look more like the light is hitting some nice, softly reflective hair. And we can also change how anisotropic it is. Now, you might not want it to be completely anisotropic, you might not want it to be completely isotropic. You probably want it to be somewhere in the middle to get a nice soft highlight that sort of stops at grazing angles. So now let's take a look at a more practical example with some textures to see how we can get some cool effects that look like light scattering through hair and just generally get a better feel for how we can create some hair highlights. So let's open this guy. We don't want to save our changes. We don't really need those. Alrighty, we're back to this guy again. And this time, we're going to be looking at some anisotropic highlights. So you can see on his hair here, we have that nice banded highlight. However, there's a couple things going on here that we didn't have in the other example. First and foremost, we have a normal map and a gloss map, but you'll also notice that there is a slightly colored band along here that looks much more saturated than what's right next to it. This is actually a secondary specular highlight that I'm using to make it look like light is penetrating through the hair and being carried along before it exits out, which is the way that hair actually behaves. Now there's a lot more to it, but we're really just simulating the sort of effect that hair has without being 100% physically accurate. So let's dive into that a little bit. We're going to come over here to his hair. So we have a normal map, which is, it's a pretty simple normal map. It's just some vertical streaks. You can see that it just adds a little bit of, it adds a little bit of undulation to the surface. If I turn it off, you can see how it affects the hair, especially at glancing angles. Let's zoom in a little bit. On and off, on and off. So really it's just there to break up that specular highlight. Next I have my gloss map, which once again is just very streaky stuff going from top to bottom. And once again, it's just there to add some variation to the width and placement of that specular highlight. So let's turn that off. Oops, and let's turn off some of the post effects so that we can get a better look at that. Let's turn off flares. There we go. And let's turn off, let's turn off some of the bloom. There we go. Okay. So now you can see that with the gloss map turned off, it has a super tight specular highlight. Let's turn that down so we can see what it looks like without a gloss map and without a normal map. See, it's just a nice smooth surface. Let's turn off some of the post effects in here so that things run a little faster. There we go, that's better. Alright, so let's turn our gloss map back on and our normal map, crank the gloss back up. So that's great and all. I mean, clearly we're going to want some texture in our hair, and we can achieve that with normal and gloss, but I have a couple of other things going on here. I do have some subsurface scattering, not too much. It's just a little bit to add some stuff. Once again, at glancing angles, you can really see it in the crevices, and it just softens up the highlight. But I also have my reflection here, which is set to anisotropic, as we mentioned before. So the anisotropy in here is set to 0.762. That's just kind of an arbitrary number. I was looking for a value that looked good, and I settled on that. I didn't want the highlight to be, traveling along the full length of the hair. I just wanted it to kind of stop at the edges, so we'll just undo that. The real key here, though, is the secondary reflection that I have here. Now, with secondary reflection, you can get some nice effects like car paint by having, say, a very diffuse colored reflection and then another reflection on top that's more glossy, and that way it can look like light is scattering through, say, a lacquer or something like that. Or with anisotropic reflections, you can actually control both the color of the highlight as well as how much it's shifted along the UV map. So it actually takes the reflection and it doesn't just stretch it, but it actually moves it along the UV coordinates. And what this does for me is it lets me add a slight tint of color to the edge of the specular highlight, which for the original is just white, so that I can make it look like it has a little bit more subsurface scattering in there. So we can change the secondary intensity to crank it up or push it back down. We can change how anisotropic it is, whether it's only affecting the highlight right over here or it's stretching along the entire length. We can change the direction, and we can change the shift of where it lands. In this case, I decided to put it slightly below, since in most cases this character is going to be lit from above, so it makes sense to have that reflection below. However, I could just as easily have it so that the refraction or the shift is just right at the center, and this is slightly less glossy, so it pushes out the highlight around the edge of the main highlight, so it looks like the subsurface scattering is going in both directions. Here you can see that if I change the color, it changes what it looks like the subsurface scattering color is. So this is just a little trick that you can use. It's not necessarily completely accurate to how hair actually reflects light, but it is a pretty handy way to add a nice richness to how hair on your portfolio pieces or anything else reflects light. Using anisotropic highlights is also a great way to achieve looks like you might see in Overwatch, where they have strong banded anisotropic highlights on all the characters' hair. If I turn off the gloss map for this, and actually the normal map as well, I turn this down and I turn down the specular intensity so it's nice and low, you can actually start to get effects that look kind of like Overwatch just with simple anisotropic highlights. Alright, so I think I'm probably going to be ending this a little bit early tonight, since I've covered basically all the topics that I wanted to talk about. But I will be hanging around for at least the next 5 to 10 minutes, so that if you guys have any questions, you can ask them in the Twitch chat, or you could even, send them to me on Twitter or whatever you like. But that covers basically everything that I wanted to mention today. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be more than happy to take them and talk with you before I go into the private hangout with the program members. So if you have any questions, now is a great time to ask in the Twitch chat. Omar asks what my favorite game of all time is. I would say that's not a good question to ask me, because I'm not the most well with its books. With books it's well read. With movies, I guess it's well watched. So well played, I suppose. Probably the game that had the biggest impact, at least on me, was the original Metal Gear Solid. Um, Simply because it introduced me to 3D gaming and the possibilities of what that can do. And along with it, I started to learn more about game development. So uh, I guess I'll say that one. That one was at least the most influential for me. And I have another question about my favorite tabletop RPG system. Um, I will admit I've not played a ton of different ones, but I'm enjoying D&D 5th edition right now quite a lot. Making lots of fun little props and doing some fun campaigns with friends and such. So there's that. I played D&D 3.5 quite a lot several years ago and enjoyed it, but found that it just wasn't quite my cup of tea. I played a little bit of Pathfinder, which was fun, but just a little bit too much. And I think I've played some Cyberpunk. I don't remember which version it was. That was quite a while ago, and it was only for one session. That was fun and completely insane. Did you guys have any questions about, say, specular or shading or computer graphics that I might be able to answer? um, let's see here. Omar's asking if there's anything special going on with the teeth shader for this guy. No, actually, the shader that I'm using for these teeth is actually the same one that I'm using for the skin. They actually don't look super hot right now because this lighting setup is not ideal. Um, in general, the reason that I use the reason that I use subsurface scattering for both the teeth and the head is that teeth in general are actually very translucent. If you go and you look in the mirror, unless you have false teeth, you're going to find that the edges of your teeth have a lot of light scattering through them. They're translucent, they refract and reflect light in ways that are much like skin, so it's pretty useful to just have them set on the same shader as the skin. Dylan asks, if the anisotropic stuff is UV based, then how do you account for when your UVs aren't set up, down, or left, right? That is an excellent question. In that case, you can use a direction map. Different programs and engines will call this different things. And yeah, it can be a flow map, a direction map. They have several different names, but in general, what it is a map that you would paint that defines the both up, down, and left, right direction that the anisotropic highlight will go. And I can actually make one really quick. It's not going to be very pretty, but I can make one in a program called Krita, or Krita. I'm not actually sure of the exact pronunciation. But basically what it lets me do is specify a direction for the highlight to go, which might not actually correspond to the UVs. Yes, you can. In theory, you can use a secondary UV channel for specifying direction. Um, Although it's not, I mean, if you're doing it for hair, for example, it might not be the best way to go about it. Oh good, I have this set up already. So here's what I'm doing in here. If I go to, if I open up Krita and I go to the tangent normal painting mode, it has a few different modes up here. But basically what you want is something that allows you to paint a direction based on the color, paint a color based on the color of your stroke, or the direction of your stroke. God, I'm getting so confused right now. Paint a color based on the direction of your stroke. So in this instance, if I paint from the lower left to the upper right, it's going to be more or less one semi-consistent color. I'm just painting this with the mouse right now. It's not going to be great, but now if I go from the upper left to the bottom right, it's going to be this bright green color. If I go horizontally or vertically, I get other colors. Basically what this does is it says if the red color, if the red amount, if the brightness of the red is X and the brightness of the green is Y, then have the flow map, or have the rather the anisotropic reflection modified by that amount in both those directions, so that it pushes itself in that direction. So let's just do something really quick here. We'll just make a nice big brush size. Just paint all in one direction-ish. And then we'll come back down and do this. So we're going to save this. Let's see, export this as. We can really just save this as a PNG. That should work. Let's call it direction, if we can spell correctly. Save that. Now if I come back here to Marmoset and I go into my hair shader and I load a direction map into this slot right here, let's see here. Let's see if we can get a good spot to show. Here we go. So I drew this kind of squiggly line, and basically what it does is it says if I am painting in this direction, modify the angle of the reflection so that it matches that. So here you can see that the angle of the reflection has been modified. And this might not be set up correctly since I'm just doing it as a quick example, but it will modify the direction of the specular highlight so that it matches the new direction that I've painted in the direction map. So I can swap the X and Y, and I can swap it back. Now when I have the direction map loaded in, it turns off the anisotropy direction because it wouldn't really make sense to have that. All you really need is to swap X and Y. So what do we got? Let's see here. So Dylan says, I hear you can do this now in Substance Painter. I haven't actually tried painting a direction map in Substance Painter. I know that a friend of mine came up with sort of a workaround to do it, though I don't know the specifics of it, and it seemed like it was a pretty involved process getting it to actually work. I've found that I have pretty good luck with Krita. It's pretty consistent, and these weird little chunky changes in color don't happen if you're, or at least don't generally happen if you're painting with a tablet. And also when you have a direction map, usually it doesn't have to be very high res, and it actually works best if it's kind of blurry, so that you can have nice unified directions that don't have a lot of contrast in them. Now you might have to play around with which channel controls which direction, and the intensity of the color, but in general, that's how you can paint a direction map for a direction map or a flow map or whatever you want to call it for anisotropic highlights. Did anyone else have any other questions about specular, reflection, gloss, anisotropic highlights, anything like that? All right. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm actually going to cut off the stream just a little bit early tonight, because as I mentioned before, I got through basically all the topics I wanted to cover. And I'm going to be jumping into the private hangout session with the program members. If you liked this, if you thought it was interesting or fun or whatever, drop by again this coming Thursday at the same time. I'm going to be talking about normal maps. I have a lot of topics to cover in that session. For example, what the hell is a normal map and why and how does it work? Along with the basics of what each channel does, how it affects shading. Some good ways to author normal maps that might not be what you necessarily learned in school or what you know. Using object space and tangent space normal maps along with hard and soft edges. I'm going to be talking about triangulation and how it affects shading. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about bent normal maps and once again touching on bit depth for normal maps, just as kind of a refresher. And yeah, if you like this, tune in, same bat time, same bat channel, and I'll be posting updates on Twitter and such as just to let you guys know when things are coming up. So if there are no more questions, I'm going to take off, and I'll see you guys again on Thursday. Alrighty, you guys have a good night, and thanks for watching.